Between 1792 and 1800, more than 400 enslaved men, women, and children built what would become the most recognizable building in America. Their names were intentionally erased from official records. Their bodies were laid to rest in unmarked graves throughout the District of Columbia. For over 2 centuries, the government insisted these omissions weren't accidental. They were policy. In 1901, a restoration crew uncovered something beneath the East Wing's foundation that caused the superintendent to order an immediate stop to all excavation. The workers were sworn to silence. The discovery was reburied within hours. What they found suggested the original construction involved far more than simple labor exploitation. It pointed to systematic concealment of deaths that occurred under conditions the young republic could never afford to acknowledge. Tonight, you'll hear what those records actually revealed. Before we continue with the story of how America's greatest symbol was built on suffering deliberately hidden from history, I want to ask you something. If you're listening from Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere in the United States, leave a comment telling us where you're from. These stories belong to all of us. And knowing where our listeners are connecting from makes this community even stronger. Now, subscribe to African Core so you never miss the dark chapters of American history they tried to bury. Let's uncover the truth together. The discovery in 1901 wouldn't be the last time someone stumbled onto evidence of what really happened during those 8 years of construction. But to understand why those findings were so dangerous, you need to know how the project began and who was truly forced to build it. Philadelphia served as the nation's capital in 1790. But the Residence Act passed that July mandated a new federal district along the Potomac River. President Washington himself selected the exact location in January 1791, 10 miles square carved from land ceded by Maryland and Virginia. The site was far from the grand landscape depicted in later paintings. It was malarial swampland, thick with mosquitoes, unbearably humid in summer, and dotted with scattered tobacco plantations worked by enslaved people who had been farming that soil for generations. The commissioners appointed to oversee construction faced an immediate problem. The federal government had no money. The entire project, the president's house, capitol, department buildings, roads, would cost an estimated $400,000. An astronomical sum for a nation still buried in Revolutionary War debt. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson proposed a solution that appeared elegant in its simplicity. Hire enslaved workers. Their masters would be paid a rental fee, typically $5 per month per enslaved person, while the workers themselves would receive nothing beyond basic food and shelter. This arrangement, Jefferson argued in a letter dated March 1792, would keep costs manageable while ensuring the work moved forward without delay or complaint. The chief architect, James Hoban, an Irish immigrant who had designed several prominent buildings in Charleston, submitted plans for the president's house in July 1792. His design drew heavily from Leinster House in Dublin, featuring Georgian symmetry and ambitious scale. When Washington reviewed the plans, he insisted on making the building even larger, 15% bigger than Hoban's original proposal. This expansion would require substantially more labor, more materials, and more time. The commissioners sent notices throughout Maryland and Virginia. Masters could hire out their enslaved workers to the federal construction project. The compensation was reliable, and the government promised to return the workers unharmed. That promise would prove meaningless. By November 1792, Approximately 150 enslaved workers had been assembled at the construction site. They came from plantations throughout the region, from Loudoun County, Charles County, Montgomery County, Prince George's County. Their masters' names appear in the commissioners' payment ledgers: Daniel Carroll, Notley Young, Samuel Davidson, William Brent. But the workers themselves were recorded differently. The ledgers list only first names, sometimes not even that, just Negro Man or Negro Boy, followed by an age estimate: Tom, age 23, Peter, age 19, a boy called Harry, perhaps 14, a man named Lynn, who the records suggest was over 50, too old for such punishing work, but hired out anyway because his master needed the monthly payment. The work began immediately. Even as winter approached, the first task involved clearing the site, removing trees, draining swampland, excavating the foundation. This meant laboring waist deep in freezing mud using nothing but shovels, pickaxes, and raw strength. The commissioner's letters from that first winter make brief mention of difficulties with the Negro labor due to weather, but provide no detail about what those difficulties involved. A note dated December 14, 1792, refers to the replacement of 3 workers who could not continue, without explaining why they couldn't continue or what happened to them. One worker who did leave a trace in the records was a man named Isaac, hired from a plantation owner named Samuel Hanson. Isaac was a skilled carpenter, one of several enslaved craftsmen brought to the project because their expertise was essential. The commissioner's correspondence shows Isaac worked on interior carpentry throughout 1793 and 1794, and that Hanson received payment for Isaac's labor through November 1794. Then Isaac's name disappears from the ledgers. No note of his return to Hanson's plantation. No record of sale or transfer, simply absent from the documents as though he had never existed. Another name that appears frequently in early records is Peter Lennox, a quarryman enslaved by Martha Custis Peter, step-granddaughter of George Washington. Lennox was assigned to oversee stone cutting at the government quarry in Aquia, Virginia, where the cream-colored sandstone for the president's house was extracted. The quarry work was among the most dangerous. Massive blocks of stone had to be cut, lifted, and transported without modern equipment. A single mistake could crush a man instantly. Lennox's name appears in payment records through 1796, noted as reliable and skilled. After 1796, he too disappears from the documentation. The commissioners, Thomas Johnson, Daniel Carroll, and David Stewart, rotated through various appointments, but their correspondence reveals a consistent anxiety about the project's timeline. President Washington wanted the house completed before his term ended in 1797. This pressure translated into grueling work schedules for the enslaved laborers. Letters exchanged between the commissioners and Hoban reference working from dawn until dark when weather permitted and running double crews on foundation work to meet deadlines. These brief mentions hint at the reality: 16-hour days, 7 days a week during favorable weather, with no compensation beyond minimal food. The living conditions were equally harsh. The enslaved workers were housed in temporary wooden structures near the construction site, crude barracks that offered little protection from the elements. An expense record from March 1793 notes the purchase of straw for Negro quarters, suggesting they slept on the ground with only straw for bedding. Another entry from August 1793 authorizes the purchase of salt fish and cornmeal for feeding Negro workers. The cheapest possible provisions, no meat, no vegetables, just enough to keep them working. Disease was inevitable. The swampland bred malaria, typhoid, dysentery. The commissioner's letters occasionally mentioned sickness among the workforce, always framed as an inconvenience to the construction schedule. A note from June 1793 complains that the flux had taken hold among the Negro laborers, reducing the available workforce by nearly a third. The flux, dysentery, could kill within days if severe. The letter says nothing about treatment or recovery, only about the delay it caused. Medical care for enslaved workers was minimal at best. The commissioners hired a physician named William Thornton to attend to workers, but his compensation records show he was paid far less for treating enslaved laborers than for treating free white workers. More tellingly, Thornton's bills reflect dramatically fewer visits to enslaved workers despite their larger numbers. When an enslaved person became too ill to work, the most common solution was to send them back to their master and hire a replacement. This practice left no paper trail documenting what happened to those who were returned, whether they recovered, whether they died, whether they were sold to recoup lost rental income. The Scottish stonemason Colin Williamson kept more detailed records than most. Williamson supervised much of the stonework and maintained a diary that survived in his family's papers until it was donated to the Library of Congress in 1968. His entries from 1794 and 1795 provide rare glimpses into daily reality. The Negro men worked the stone despite bleeding hands, he wrote in April 1794. They are given no gloves, no proper tools for their hands, yet are expected to produce the same quality as trained masons. Several have infections that should be treated. I mentioned this to the commissioner's representative, who said care would be provided when time allowed. Time, it seems, never allows. Williamson's diary also records an incident from July 1794 that does not appear in any official documentation. Today, a scaffold collapsed on the south wall. 3 men fell, 2 of them Negroes. The white man was carried to the physician immediately. The 2 Negroes were left where they fell for nearly an hour before anyone attended them. One appears to have a broken back. I suspect he will not survive, and if he does, he will never walk again. This troubles me greatly, but I am told this is not my concern. The man with the suspected broken back was likely a worker named Ben, enslaved by William Brent. Ben's name appears in payment ledgers through June 1794, then stops. Brent continued to receive payment for Negro labor in July and August 1794, but the name changes to Negro Man Jim. This pattern, sudden name substitutions in the payment records without explanation, occurs repeatedly throughout the construction period, suggesting workers were being replaced while the circumstances of their departure were deliberately left unrecorded. By 1795, the structural shell was largely complete, but interior work would take several more years. The project expanded to include not just the president's house, but also the surrounding landscape, roads, and ancillary buildings. This expansion meant the workforce actually grew during the latter half of the decade. At its peak in 1798, somewhere between 400 and 500 workers labored on the site and in related operations like the quarries, brick kilns, and lumber mills. The majority were enslaved. The commissioner's papers from this period grow increasingly terse about the enslaved workforce. Earlier letters at least referenced them by category: Negro carpenters, Negro laborers, Negro quarrymen. After 1795, the references become vaguer. Workers hired from area plantations, contracted labor servants. This shift in language was not accidental. As the project gained visibility and public attention, the commissioners became more careful in how they documented the composition of the workforce. They understood, even then, that the optics were troubling. Here was the house of the president, the symbol of the new republic, being built by people who had no freedom in that republic. George Washington himself visited the construction site multiple times throughout the 1790s. His diary entries from these visits focus on architectural progress and concerns about timing. He never once mentions the enslaved workers in these entries, despite the fact that they made up at least 70% of the workforce. This omission speaks volumes about how the founders chose to see, or not see, the labor that built their institutions. The white laborers on site, immigrants primarily from Ireland and Scotland, were paid actual wages, typically $1 per day for skilled craftsmen, 50 cents for ordinary laborers. They could leave if they chose. They could complain about conditions. They had names in the records that included surnames, places of origin, and next of kin. When they were injured, they received medical care and compensation. When they died, they were buried in marked graves and their families were notified. None of this applied to the enslaved workers. They had no choice, no voice, no recourse. They built the house stone by stone, brick by brick, knowing they would never walk through its doors as anything but servants, knowing their children would inherit their chains, knowing their names would be forgotten, while the names of the architects, commissioners, and presidents would be etched into history books. But some of them left marks anyway, small, deliberate acts of presence that would only be uncovered centuries later. In the spring of 1796, James Hoban reported a problem to the commissioners. Several stone blocks being set into the north wall bore unusual markings, shallow scratches that appeared intentional rather than accidental damage from quarrying or transport. Hoban's letter, dated April 3, 1796, described them as crude symbols or letters, purpose unknown. He asked whether the blocks should be replaced or simply turned inward so the markings would not be visible. The commissioner's reply, dated April 10th, instructed Hoban to turn the stones inward and proceed with construction. The markings were likely meaningless scratches from handling. There is no need to delay work for such trivialities, the letter stated. The matter was considered closed, but the markings were not meaningless. They were names. Enslaved workers with stone cutting skills had carved their names, or sometimes only initials, into blocks they had shaped themselves. The carvings were subtle, easily dismissed as incidental marks unless you knew what to look for. They were acts of extraordinary courage, because if discovered during the carving, the punishment would have been severe. But they did it anyway. These men, whose names appeared in the ledgers only as Tom or Peter or Negro man, carved those names, and sometimes full names like Isaac, into stone, then sent those blocks to become permanent parts of the president's house. It was their way of saying, "We were here. We built this. Remember us." Hoban never reported finding additional marked stones, which suggests either he stopped noticing them or stopped reporting them. Given the commissioner's dismissive response, the latter seems more likely. Why bother troubling the commissioners with something they had already deemed irrelevant? The marked stones would not be rediscovered until 1902 during Theodore Roosevelt's renovation of the building. Workers removing plaster from interior walls found stones with their carved faces turned inward exactly as Hoban had been instructed to place them. The renovation supervisor, a man named Charles McKim, noted the discovery in his private records, found various stones with crude markings on interior faces. Some appeared to be initials or names, origin uncertain, likely made by workers during original construction. McKim's notes suggest he understood the importance, but no official report was ever filed. The stones remained in place, hidden behind new plaster, but the marked stones were only a small part of what had been deliberately concealed. The more significant hiding began in the summer of 1797, following an incident that could have destroyed the project's already fragile reputation. July 1797 brought one of the worst heat waves anyone could remember. Temperatures rose above 100 degrees for days on end. The combination of extreme heat, swamp humidity, and inadequate water supplies created catastrophic conditions for the workers. Within 2 weeks, dozens of enslaved laborers fell ill with what the commissioner's correspondence refers to vaguely as summer fevers. The commissioners sent urgent letters to plantation owners. Your workers have taken sick and cannot continue. Send replacements. These letters are unusually numerous for late July and early August 1797. At least 23 survive in the archives. Each requests immediate replacement workers, which suggests the number of sick laborers exceeded 23, possibly by a substantial margin. What happened to those workers? The commissioner's papers contain no follow-up correspondence explaining their fate. Plantation owners' replies, where they survive, are terse acknowledgments. Replacement sent. No mention of the sick workers being returned. No mention of recovery. No mention of death. Nothing. Colin Williamson's diary entries from this period are harrowing. The sickness spreads through the Negro quarters like wildfire. He wrote on July 23, 1797, I have seen at least a dozen men too weak to stand, yet there is no physician attending them. They lie in those wretched barracks burning with fever, and no one seems concerned except to determine when replacement workers will arrive. I asked the commissioner's man what provisions had been made for treatment. He told me the sick ones had been moved to an isolated area to prevent contagion from spreading to the other workers. When I asked where this isolated area was, he became evasive and told me it was not my concern. Williamson's entry from July 28th is even more disturbing. I have learned where the sick are being kept. There is a hastily constructed shed near the old kiln site, perhaps a quarter mile from the main construction. I walked there this morning despite being told to keep to my assigned area. What I found troubles me deeply. At least 20 men lie in that shed with almost no care. One woman, a young girl, cannot be more than 16, tends to them as best she can with nothing but water and rags. The heat inside that shed is unbearable. Many of the men are clearly dying. Williamson's final entry on the subject, dated August 5, 1797, is chilling in its brevity. The shed near the kiln is empty now, all of them. I asked what happened to the men who were there. I was told they had recovered and been sent back to their plantations, but I saw no wagons arrive to transport them. I saw no men walking or being assisted away. The shed is simply empty, and no one will speak of it. I suspect something terrible has occurred, but I have no proof and no one to tell who would care what happened to those sick workers. If they had truly recovered and been returned, there would have been documentation, letters from plantation owners acknowledging their return, complaints about workers arriving in weakened condition. Something. Instead, there is silence, an absence in the records where answers should be. That silence is not accidental. It is the same silence that followed the scaffold collapse, the same silence that followed the disappearing names in the payment ledgers, the same silence that allowed people to vanish from the workforce without explanation. And it marks the moment when the truth about what happened during the construction of the president's house was deliberately buried. One of the few surviving plantation owner letters from this period provides a deeply troubling hint. Samuel Hansen, the man who had hired out Isaac the carpenter, wrote to the commissioners in September 1797, inquiring about 3 of his enslaved workers who had been sent to the project in June. "I have received payment for their labor through July," Hansen wrote, "but they have not been returned as I expected when I sent replacement workers in August. I would like to know their whereabouts and when they might return, as I have need of them for harvest work." The commissioner's reply, dated September 18, 1797, is maddeningly vague. "The workers to which you refer were afflicted with summer illness and could not continue. Arrangements were made for their care. We will inquire into their present situation and inform you accordingly." No follow-up letter exists to show whether the commissioners ever provided that information. Hansen's subsequent correspondence contains no further mention of those 3 workers, suggesting either he received a private verbal response or eventually stopped asking. But some plantation owners did not stop asking. In November 1797, William Brent sent a sharply worded letter to the commissioners demanding the return of 5 enslaved workers who had not come back to his plantation despite being replaced months earlier. "I have lost the use of 5 able workers for which I continue to receive payment," Brent wrote. "Yet the workers themselves have not returned. This arrangement cannot continue. I demand either the return of these workers or an explanation of why they cannot return, along with compensation for their loss if they have died in federal service." This letter struck a nerve. The commissioner's response came within 3 days, unusually fast, and its tone was defensive. "The workers to which you refer met with unfortunate circumstances during their service. Death occurred despite best efforts at treatment. We regret this outcome, but note that the work they were engaged in carried inherent risks which were known when they were contracted. Payment to you for their labor will cease as of November 1st, 1797. No additional compensation can be provided." At least 5 of Brent's workers had died. The commissioners admitted as much when forced to, but offered no details about how they died, where they were buried, or whether their families were informed. The letter treats their deaths as an unfortunate but ordinary business matter. The workers died. The rental payment stopped. The matter was considered closed. How many others died? The commissioner's admission regarding Brent's 5 workers suggests deaths occurred but were being deliberately obscured in the records. If deaths were mentioned only when a plantation owner specifically demanded answers, how many deaths went entirely unreported because no one with standing bothered to ask? The architectural historian who would later analyze these documents, a man named Benjamin Latrobe Jr., son of the famous architect, estimated in an 1882 private letter that between 30 and 50 enslaved persons likely perished during the president's house construction, though official records acknowledge no such thing. Latrobe based this estimate on gaps in the payment ledgers, sudden substitutions of names, and the unusually high number of replacement workers requested during certain periods, particularly the summer of 1797. But even Latrobe's estimate may have been conservative. If 50 people died during 8 years of construction with hundreds of workers employed, that would actually represent a relatively low mortality rate given the conditions. Other large construction projects of the era, canals, fortifications, harbor works, regularly saw mortality rates of 10 to 15% among enslaved laborers. If that rate applied to the president's house, with an estimated 400 to 500 enslaved workers cycling through the project, the death toll could have reached 40 to 75 people. Where were they buried? This question leads back to the discovery the superintendent made in 1901, the one that caused an immediate halt to excavation and sworn secrecy among the workers. That restoration project involved reinforcing the East Wing's foundation. Laborers dug down to expose the original foundation stones laid in 1792, roughly 6 feet below the existing ground level. What they uncovered were bones, human bones, at least a dozen skulls, according to the superintendent's private notes, along with numerous other bones that appear to have been buried hastily and without ceremony. No coffins, no markers. Just remains in the soil beneath the building's foundation. The superintendent, a man named Henry Reed, immediately grasped the implications. If word spread that human remains had been found in unmarked graves beneath the White House, it would provoke investigations, questions, and potentially massive public scandal. Reed made a decision that very afternoon. The bones would be reburied exactly where they were found. No one outside the work crew would be told, and renovation would continue in another section of the foundation. Reed kept a personal diary, which his descendants donated to the National Archives in 1978. His entry from October 12, 1901, describes the discovery in detail. We found them approximately 6 feet down, just outside the original eastern foundation line. The bones were mixed together with no attempt at proper burial that I could discern. Some skulls showed damage consistent with trauma, though I am no medical expert. We counted at least 12 skulls, possibly more, as some were fragmentary. The Negro workers on our crew became very quiet when we uncovered them. One older man, a fellow named Joseph, who has worked on the grounds for 40 years, said he had heard stories from his grandfather about workers buried near the house during original construction. He said his grandfather called them the Forgotten Ones. We reburied everything before the end of the day. I instructed all workers that nothing had been found and that anyone speaking of this discovery would be immediately dismissed. I then moved the foundation work to the western side. I could not risk this becoming public knowledge. I confess I felt quite ill all evening thinking of those poor souls buried like refuse beneath this great house. Reed never filed an official report about the discovery. He never informed the president's staff or the Interior Department. He simply ensured the bones remained concealed and carried the secret with him until his death in 1924. Only the later discovery of his diary, decades afterward, revealed what had been found and quietly buried again. The bones raised troubling questions. If enslaved workers had been interred just outside the foundation, had they died during construction and been disposed of as quickly and silently as possible? Were these some of the same workers who vanished from the records during the summer of 1797? And were there additional burial sites elsewhere on the grounds that had never been discovered? Reed's diary mentions that some skulls showed damage consistent with trauma. That could mean many things: injuries from construction accidents, the physical toll of brutal labor, or even violence. The diary does not elaborate, and without proper forensic examination, which Reed refused to allow, the truth of how these people died would remain forever unknown. What is certain is that at least a dozen human beings were buried in unmarked graves on the White House grounds, and that this fact was deliberately hidden, not just in 1797, but again in 1901, when the evidence was literally in hand. Someone decided both times that these deaths were better left unacknowledged, but the question of who made that decision in 1797 and whether the deaths were truly accidents or something worse would linger over the project's later history. The president's house was not completed until November 1800, when John Adams became the first president to occupy it. By that point, most of the enslaved workers who had built it had been returned to plantations scattered across Maryland and Virginia. Their role in creating the building was already being written out of the official story. The commissioner's final report on the project, submitted in December 1800, is a masterwork of omission. It details every architectural feature, every expense, every challenge overcome. It praises James Hoban's design and George Washington's vision. It thanks the skilled craftsmen who brought the building to life. It never once mentions that the majority of those craftsmen were enslaved people who received no payment, no recognition, and in some cases, no burial. Thomas Jefferson moved into the house in March 1801 following his inauguration. Jefferson brought his own enslaved workers from Monticello, cooks, servants, laborers, to maintain the building and its grounds. For Jefferson, the presence of enslaved people in the house was neither ironic nor contradictory. It was simply the way things were. He wrote eloquently about liberty while surrounded by people who possessed none, and he never appeared to grasp the profound dissonance of that arrangement. The building would later become known as the White House, though the origin of the name is disputed. Some claim it came from the white paint used to cover the sandstone walls after British troops burned the building in 1814. Others argue it was always called that because of the aqueous sandstone's natural pale color. Either way, the name took hold, and with it grew a mythology about the building's construction that was almost entirely false. Official White House histories written throughout the 19th century barely acknowledged the enslaved workforce. When they did mention their existence, it was through euphemistic language: servants, workers from local plantations, contracted labor. The implication was always that these were ordinary employees doing ordinary work for ordinary compensation. The reality that they were enslaved, that they had no choice, that they received nothing, was softened, sanitized, rendered invisible. Even accounts that admitted slavery's role in construction tended to minimize it. An 1831 guidebook to Washington described the building as erected by skilled craftsmen and laborers brought together through the federal commissioner's diligent efforts. Technically accurate, but brought together, makes coerced labor sound like voluntary cooperation rather than forced work. The guidebook's author, a man named Jonathan Elliott, certainly knew the truth. He had examined the commissioner's papers, but chose words that would not disturb readers' patriotic pride in the building. This pattern of selective memory continued through the century as major renovations took place in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1860s. Newspapers covered these projects extensively, but never thought to investigate who had built the original structure or under what conditions. When presidents gave tours and speeches about the house's history, they spoke of architectural influences from Irish and Scottish traditions, but never mentioned the African hands that had actually raised the walls. Some people did know the truth. They simply lacked the means to share it. Within enslaved communities in Washington and the surrounding areas, the story of the building's construction was passed down through generations. Elderly men and women who had worked on the project told their children and grandchildren what it had really been like. They spoke of the heat, the sickness, the friends who disappeared and never returned. They talked about bones buried on the grounds, markings hidden in the walls, and names no one would remember. One of these stories was preserved in an extraordinary document discovered in 1978. Among papers donated to Howard University was a handwritten narrative by a woman named Celia Robertson, born into slavery in 1819. Robertson's grandfather, Thomas, had worked on the president's house construction in the 1790s. She wrote down his stories as he told them to her in the 1840s, creating one of the only first-hand accounts of what the work was actually like. Thomas's stories, filtered through his granddaughter's memory and careful writing, painted a picture far darker than any official history. Grandfather Thomas said they worked until their hands bled and their backs could not straighten. He said the white overseers did not see them as men, but as tools, like the hammers and saws. When a tool broke, you got another. When a man fell, you got another man. He said they buried friends at night when no one was watching, said prayers over them that nobody wrote down. He said his friend Peter carved his name into a stone and told Thomas, "They'll forget us, but the stone will remember long after we're gone. Our names will be in those walls even if nobody can see them." Grandfather cried when he told me that, Robertson wrote. He said Peter never came home from the work, said he fell sick one summer and they took him away, and that was the last anyone ever saw of him. Robertson's account goes on to describe her grandfather's trauma after the experience. He suffered nightmares about the house for the rest of his life. She wrote that he would wake shaking, saying he could still hear the sounds of men dying in the shed where they took the sick ones. He said he tried to help them, tried to bring them water, but the overseers would not allow him near. He said you could hear them calling out for their mothers, for their wives, for water, for mercy. He said the sound stopped after a few days, and then the shed was empty, and no one would say what happened to those men. Thomas also described the scaffold collapse that left several workers dead, confirming Colin Williamson's diary entry. Grandfather said he saw the scaffold break and 3 men fall, 1 white man and 2 colored. The white man was carried away and tended to at once. The 2 colored men lay there broken on the ground for nearly an hour before anyone even looked at them. 1 man's leg was twisted wrong and he kept screaming. The other was not moving at all. Finally, they carried them both to the shed. He never saw either of them again. Robertson's document was not publicly known until it was uncovered among Howard University's archives and mentioned in an obscure academic journal in 1982. Even then, it received little attention. The mainstream historical community largely ignored it, perhaps because it contradicted the more comfortable narrative about the building's origins that had been established over nearly 2 centuries. But the document raised serious questions. If Thomas's memories were accurate, and there is no reason to believe his granddaughter fabricated them, then the official record had deliberately concealed numerous deaths and horrific working conditions. The shed where the sick were taken matched the location Colin Williamson described in his diary. The scaffold collapse matched Williamson's account almost perfectly. Thomas's stories and Williamson's contemporary observations corroborated each other across decades. This convergence of evidence pointed to something historians had long suspected but could never conclusively prove. The construction of the president's house involved significant loss of enslaved lives, and those losses were systematically erased from the historical record. The physical evidence supported this conclusion as well. In 1978, the same year Robertson's account was uncovered, a team of archaeologists conducted a survey of the White House grounds as part of a comprehensive historical documentation project. The survey included ground-penetrating radar analysis of areas that had never been developed or significantly disturbed since the 1790s. The radar revealed anomalies consistent with unmarked graves in at least 3 locations on the grounds. One site lay very close to where Henry Reed's crew had discovered bones in 1901. Another was near the old kiln site that Williamson had described in his diary. The third was located in an area that is now part of the Rose Garden. The archaeologists noted these findings in their technical report, but recommended against excavation. Given the political sensitivity of potentially discovering human remains on the White House grounds, the report stated, and the fact that any such remains would likely be enslaved individuals buried without ceremony or record, we recommend these sites be left undisturbed and marked as potentially sensitive areas for future reference. In other words, the evidence was there, but disturbing it was deemed too complicated. This decision, like Henry Reed's choice in 1901 and the commissioner's choices in the 1790s, placed institutional reputation above historical truth and human dignity. The people buried in those unmarked graves were forgotten in death just as they had been exploited in life. Even when evidence of their existence surfaced, the response was to bury it again, either literally or figuratively. The architectural historian Benjamin Latrobe Jr., who had estimated 30 to 50 deaths, became consumed with uncovering the true toll. After reviewing surviving commissioners' papers in the 1880s, Latrobe began corresponding with elderly African Americans in the Washington area, gathering oral histories before that generation passed away. He recorded accounts from 17 people whose grandparents or great-grandparents had worked on the president's house. Their stories were strikingly consistent: brutal labor, insufficient food and water, widespread illness, people who vanished and were never heard from again. Several specifically mentioned the deadly summer of 1797. Latrobe compiled these accounts into a manuscript he titled The Hidden Cost: Enslaved Labor in the Construction of Federal Buildings. No publisher would touch it. The responses were uniform: too controversial, unsuitable for the current readership, damaging to respected institutions. Latrobe died in 1887, his work unpublished. When it was finally printed decades later in a small academic run, it quickly fell out of circulation. The truth existed. It was documented. But it could not compete with the comforting mythology surrounding the White House as a pure symbol of American ideals. And so the building endured, gleaming in the Washington sun. Tour guides praised its architecture. Presidents spoke of its legacy. Visitors admired its beauty. Few ever considered what lay beneath their feet: unmarked graves, hidden names, lives expended and erased. The questions that should have been asked in 1797 were never asked. The investigations that should have happened in 1867 or 1891 or 1901 never came. The recognition that was owed was never given. This is how truth disappears, not in a single dramatic act of censorship, but in countless small decisions to remain silent, to look away, to choose comfort over honesty. Each decision seemed reasonable on its own. Together, they ensured that the people who built the most famous house in America would remain invisible. What do you think happened to the workers whose names vanished from the records? How many do you believe truly died? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story unsettled you, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who needs to hear these forgotten histories. See you in the next video.